All stand. All persons having anything to do with the sitting of the Supreme Court of Tasmania draw nigh and give your attendance. Please be seated.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Armstrong.
Good morning, Your Honour. The matter is continuing. Before I resume with Mr. Gilmore, Your Honour, there were a couple of tenders that yet again I overlooked from yesterday. Can I just mention that the photograph that I took Your Honour and Mr. Gilmore to from Court Book Document 155 that showed the area of the old stump after the contractor had been and had dug it up and then overlaid the topsoil was something I intended to tender. And of course each of the screenshots that I asked Mr. Gilmore to annotate yesterday were also intended to be tendered.
Okay.
Now, good morning, Mr. Gilmore.
Good morning.
I'd like now to return, please, to the general topic of the cause or possible cause of the Fawcett bushfire. And if Mr. Temponi could please bring up document 15 in the court book again, which is your 2020 report that I've been referring to as the second report. And could we please go, Mr. Temponi, to page 0275. And you'll see here, Mr. Gilmore, you recognise this as the part of your second report that deals with question 2, namely providing an opinion on the cause or possible causes of the fire.
Yes.
Now, having regard to the matters that we discussed yesterday, Mr. Gilmore, in relation to the various excavations of the area connected to the old stump and the fact that the new tree had grown and the dog had been buried and Mr. Bones and Mr. Walkley had excavated the area, Mr. Thomas had excavated the area, you would agree with me, I take it, that the area that had been excavated to the north and northeast of the old stump, by the time you and Mr. Crowe got there in November 2018, had been very substantially compromised.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you also gave evidence yesterday to His Honour about the process of excavations that you followed in relation to the spiky stump and Mr. Crowe followed in relation to the old stump. Could I ask you to turn your attention, please, Mr. Gilmore, to paragraph 178 that we see at the bottom of the screen here. And from the second sentence, sorry, I should say, the second sentence needs to be corrected to be actually accurate, doesn't it? In that Mr. Crowe excavated the area that was thought to be associated with the old stump, while you excavated the area that you thought was associated with the spiky stump, correct?
No, that's not correct. So we excavated around the site that people previously had excavated, and I was excavating the area in relation to the spiky stump, and Mr. Crowe the area of the old stump.
All right, thank you. Now, the third sentence, starting the line of coals, that was the subject of Mr. Crowe's focus of inquiry rather than yours, correct?
No, not correct. So there are a series of photos of the excavation in the TFS report and the police photography that was taken of that. And it was heading in a direction and then turned about 80 degrees. And when that excavation completed, it was actually heading to the east of the spiky stump, so it wasn't actually heading to either of those stumps.
Right, and you would expect that roots from an old tree, like either the spiky stump or the old stump, would meander and change directions in the course of their growth?
Yeah, I think that shows clearly in the photos, doesn't it?
And in terms of the excavations that were done in respect of the old stump, just to recap, your evidence yesterday was that Mr. Crowe had scraped some soil around the area that was thought to have been the old stump down to about 100 mil and had identified an ice cream cone shaped stump, root that was thought to have been part of the old stump, correct?
Yes.
And then about 2 metres to the north or northeast of where he'd scraped away the soil, he dug another excavation of, again, about 100 millimetres deep, and he didn't find anything there that indicated the presence of a tree root.
No, I think the second one was a tree root as well.
Okay, so at 100 millimetres deep, he found a tree root.
Yes.
Right. Now, in circumstances, Mr. Gilmore, where you now know that the TFS, in the course of their excavations in that area, had dug to a depth of about 500 mil before they before they gave up the excavation, trying to follow the line of charcoal and charcoal powder. You would agree with me that digging in the same area simply to a depth of 100 mil is not going to tell you anything about the presence or direction of any charcoal or charcoal path that the TFS had identified in their excavations another 400 millimetres further down.
Yeah, I think the two excavations are in different places. For Mr. Crow's excavation was around the old stump, and the excavation that was at 500 millimetres was closer to the spiky stump, about due north from it, and the direction of the charcoal heading just to the east of the spiky stump.
Well, again, Mr. Gilmore, if Mr. Crow or yourself had not dug down to the same depth as the TFS had identified the burned root, then your excavation is not going to tell you anything about what might have been there further down below the depth to which you reached.
I'm thinking about the costine type thing that I described, the trench, and roots coming from the crown and getting deeper as they're further away from the tree. So there is a possibility if there was a root that had burnt down from the tree crown and the root headed down, that costine may have discovered it.
Now that costine that you refer to was the costine that you dug for the purpose of checking the degree of underground burning that might be associated with the spiky stump, correct?
Yes.
There was no equivalent costine dug in respect of the old stump?
No, but my concentration was on the spiky stump.
Yes, and you understand, Mr. Gilmore, that I'm asking you about the old stump at the moment. So just to be clear, there was no equivalent costine dug in relation to, dug between the area of the TFS excavation and the old stump, wasn't there?
No.
Right.
In fact, I thought yesterday, Mr. Gilmore, you said that you weren't even trying to dig that line.
No, I was concentrating on where I thought that line of charcoal had gone.
And when I say you, I mean you and Mr. Crow. Neither of you were trying to dig that line.
No, he dug a little bit round the stumps that were visible from the old stump.
But not the line that we know to be the line from marker 20 to the old stump.
No, we weren't investigating that. So if that helps. Yes.
Now, given that answer, Mr. Gilmore, if you weren't investigating the line from the TFS point of excavation to the old stump, the third sentence in paragraph 178 is really not a sentence that follows at all from the excavation or investigation that you and Mr. Crow undertook, is it? So you simply cannot say, you cannot plausibly reach the conclusion that's reflected in the third sentence, can you?
Well, we observed burning on both stumps.
Yes.
One having been substantially disturbed, I now understand.
Yes.
And we observed to where that burning stopped. And so that's what our excavations were about, if you like.
Well, again, Mr. Gilmore, we need to be a little bit more careful about your evidence. You observed, you think, to about where the burning stopped in a route that you found that you thought was connected to the spiky stump, correct?
Yes.
and you or Mr. Crow observed burning to a certain point on a route that you observed that you thought might have been connected to the old stump,
Yes.
correct? And your excavations in the area of the old stump involved, we've heard several times, little more than scraping away some topsoil and to a depth of about 100 millimetres, and that was it.
Yes.
So you don't know what might have been further down, below 100 millimetres depth, that might have been connected to the old stump, do you?
No. No, this is just factual, what we saw, burn and char marks.
All right. Okay. Now, next, could Mr. Temponi please take us to paragraph 193 on Court Book page 279 of your second report. And you refer there, in fact, perhaps if we could go up to the top of the page, and if it's possible to scroll up so that we can also see paragraph 190, please, Mr. Temponi. Thank you. Now, Mr. Gilmore, you are referring there to your observation that when you were at the site in late 2018, you found indicia of other stumps within an area. You say the area from previous clearing. Now, firstly, can you please clarify for His Honour, when you refer to the area in the first sentence of paragraph 190, what area are you talking about?
Generally, the edge of the forested area, although some of the forest was young. So the forest near the septic line, the shorter trees. So basically there's a bit of an outline of area that has been forest in the past and was cleared for agricultural house
Can
or
I
whatever.
just pause you there, Mr. Gilmore, because we'll do this by reference to a photograph again. If Mr. Temponi could bring up document 101, and let's go to photograph 63, near and dear to all our hearts. And if Mr. Temponi could enlarge the bottom right-hand quadrant of the photograph so that we've got the area from the driveway across to the... That's about it, thank you. And take a screenshot, please, Mr. Temponi. So, again, Mr. Gilmore, when you talk about the area, by reference to this photograph, could you please indicate what's the area that you're talking about where you found stumps from previous clearing?
Okay, so would it be easier to just mark where I remember the stumps being?
Yes, please.
So, Mr. Temponi, if we go up a substantial amount of distance, yeah, about there and across.
To the right or left?
Sorry, yes, to the left. I'm imagining if you can read my mind, I'm sorry. Further to the left, stop there, up towards that tree, up. Yeah, just there. If you put a circle around that, at the base of that tree, there is quite a substantial stump there that burnt down to some depth, and I think was even measured the depth of that burning during the TFS investigation. If we come down, there are, and yeah, stop there, and across to the right, a bit further to the right, and then stop there, and down a little bit, somewhere around about there, if you put a circle, that's the small stump burning into the ground that I took a photograph of, that I suppose someone's put out. It seemed to be on the edge of the fire. There is the two stumps we've been talking about, obviously. There are areas of deeper burning which are probably logs and stumps over near where the bulldozed pile is. And then
just pause there. The bulldozed pile is over near the big log, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So if we go over to the right, and up, Mr. Temponi, and across to the right. So that white area is a bulldozed pile of elevated dirt, and in there is areas of burning that have been burning for a long time, and the stump adjacent to that on the right shows the effects, and I think what it actually shows is the effect of that log burning up against it for a considerable amount of time. And in the TFS area of origin shown by the pink tape, there are various stumps showing various amounts of damage. So there is one, if we go up, Mr. Temponi, and across to the left, just there. So there's one there associated with one of those reeds that in that area there, and then to the left, I'll come straight down. There's one visible. Down further. Yep, just up about where the tape is. You can see the little stump there, just sort of hidden by the. That had some burn and char marks on it, and then there is another one, I think, from memory, to the top left of that square, about where that pink line is somewhere, but I can't see it on the photo. I'm sorry. So that's some of the ones that we saw. So.
All right. So I'll tender that photograph, Your Honour, and then if Mr. Temponi. Could take us back to your second report. And now go down to paragraph 193. I take it, Mr. Gilmore, that the thrust of the point that you're making in paragraph 193 is that you can exclude these other stumps as being potential points of origin for the bushfire.
I think that they appeared to be burnt by the fire. Yes, that was my impression, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Now, in relation, if we could just scroll up a little, please, Mr. Temponi, to the photograph that's shown there. Now, you described that, Mr. Gilmore, as looking west on the edge of the area of origin at a charred root which extinguished before burning underground. Do you see that?
Yes.
It would take, in a situation of a root that's just emerging slightly from the surrounding soil in terrain like that, it would require such a root to be exposed to quite a prolonged flame before you would expect combustion to start in the root in a way that might then become a self-sustaining smouldering burn through the root system, wouldn't it?
What it would require is some containment or reflection inwards of heat. So it can happen with quite a small, it can happen with a spark if there's a crack and the spark goes into it. And so when a house burns in bushfire, it quite often burns where the two gable pieces of wood join together up near the roof. The little crack in there is quite a common place for houses to catch fire in bushfires. So if there was wood adjacent to that or rock adjacent to it, reflecting heat back in, it would be much more likely to catch fire. So I think back to when we were burning stumps on the sides of roads in forestry to try and improve roadways. The stacking of green timber around a stump allows you to burn quite a large stump quite easily.
Right.
Heat reflected in is probably the important thing.
And put to one side the possibility of outlier situations. You would agree with me, Mr. Gilmore, that the probability is that in order for a root mostly buried in the ground something like what we see in this photograph to catch fire, that is to start combusting in a way that could become a smouldering burn extending along the route underground, the probability is that it would need to be exposed to a significant level of heat and probably for a prolonged period of time.
It would be like lighting an open fire. So if it had kindling around it, that would be more likely than a large, like end of the route with a spark hitting it or something.
Yeah. So. And if we can see that this photograph is obviously taken when you were there in late November, we see that the grass is still green. Given what you've seen of the photographs of the area around the old stump in early January 2013, you would agree that the fuel that was present on the ground at that time was or appeared to be very dry?
Yes, there is an area outside the burnt area associated with one of the photographs. My estimate is that the curing is about 80% in the grasslands at that time.
And it's very low levels of grass. It's been trimmed in some way or kept low?
Yeah, I think whippersnipped around that area would be
And the depth of the fuel looks to have been extremely shallow. It was very sparse across the dirt.
In the unburnt area, yes. Yeah.
And you would expect that as well as the dry grass, there was also some leaf litter and other debris that had blown across the area.
Yes.
And again, that debris looks to have been very sparse, very thin and very dry.
The further away from the trees, the less of that you'll get.
Yes.
And I would expect the younger stand of trees to have less of that than the mature trees. And it's a combination of leaves, small twigs and bark that fall from the trees. So the leaves are probably more inclined to travel than the other two components.
Okay. And in the conditions which existed in the afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013, you would expect that if any of the fuel that you imagine was lying on the ground in the area around the old stump had been exposed to a flame, then that fuel would have burned to the point of incineration very quickly.
So by incineration you mean disappeared?
Disappeared to ash, ceased to be a source of sufficient heat to ignite the cellulose material in other vegetation.
I think there's variable burning amounts shown. So some places, as we discussed yesterday in some of the photos, there are some bits of fuel remaining and some not in the area. But yeah, I agree that it was dry. The grass would basically combust.
Almost instantly.
It's the grass fire is normally wind driven, burns well, but as we saw in the photos, not all of the grass burned.
And even if there had been some leaf litter or grass near a tree stump protruding from the ground slightly, something like we see in this photograph, and that grass or leaf litter had caught alight, then it was more probably than not going to be incinerated and self-extinguish before it was able to transfer enough heat into the root nearby to be able to ignite a self-sustaining smouldering burn in that root, wasn't it?
Right, I now understand. The purpose of photographing this root was because of the amount of burning on the end. So it actually burnt enough to form charcoal and had been alight, and appeared to me as if it had been alight and been put out. So the entire, I apologise for the level of photography, but the entire end of that was charcoal and had been burning. And then there was a little spot further down, perhaps, what's that, 100 millimetres or a little bit further down, that there was further burning, but that wasn't as deep. But the the entire end of that root was alight, and so that's why that caught my attention. And if you look further up, you can see the unburnt root continuing on.
And even that root had self-extinguished, hadn't it?
Now, my impression was that it was put out because there was a line that I could see that was approximately where the edge of the backing fire had been extinguished, where there was no moss anymore.
Back to my question, please, Mr. Gilmore.
Mm-hmm.
I asked you to imagine a root protruding from the ground, only in part, perhaps something like what we see in this photograph, perhaps even less was exposed to the air. Given what you've seen of the types and depths and dryness of the fuel in this area on the 3rd of January 2013, you would agree with me that even if the fuel near such a root had been exposed to a flame, that fuel was itself likely to be incinerated before it was able to transfer enough heat into the root that I'm asking you to imagine, such as might be able to cause that root itself to develop a self-sustaining smouldering burn.
If it was clear round, open with a little bit of fuel you're describing and no reflection, then I would be surprised if it caught fire, yes.
And it would take quite a lot of heat over a prolonged period to generate enough, to transfer enough heat into such a root that the root would then be able to smoulder underground for something like 2 or 4 or 6 metres, wouldn't it?
Well, once it's alight, one of the issues is how moist the ground is. So if it's going into the ground and the ground's dry, it's much different to if the ground's moist. So it's if it's alight in the first place would be perhaps the factor that may have the most influence. Another factor may be the type of material that is burning, and so different types of woods and different trees as firewood are much better than others. So the messmate, the obliqua, that's in other parts of this site is a bit of a soapy, soft wood and doesn't burn all that well and burns black.
I can probably stop you there, Mr. Gilmore. We're talking about the one or both of the 2 stumps that you've referred to as the old stump or the spiky stump.
Oh, yeah.
Now, were you able to tell what kind of species they were?
No.
You don't have any botanical expertise that lets you make any assessment as to what kind of species they were, do you?
Oh, yes, I'm quite au fait with tree species.
Okay. Well,
and my understanding is that they were determined to be silver peppermint
right.
because of the ground type that was there. They were determined to most likely be that.
Okay, well, let's put messmate to one side then. Thinking about the roots of the silver peppermint tree. And I ask you as well to factor into your thinking the possibility that the root that peeked out of the soil might have been located in ground that was itself undulating. There might have been small edges from past erosion, stones in the area, a number of factors that indicate that the ground is not as smooth as a bowling green. Given the fuel that we see indicated to have been in this area, even if that fuel had been exposed to a flame, most of the heat is going to rise, isn't it?
The heat radiates out in all directions.
Right.
So the convective heat rises,
Yes.
but the radiant heat is what actually heats up the fuel ahead of the fire.
Are you aware of statistics, Mr. Gilmore, that something like 90% of the heat of a flame on the ground rises rather than radiates laterally or goes down into the ground?
Yes, and a good deal of the radiation comes out of the plume as well. So if the plume leans in the wind, the radiation down to the ground is much, much more than at the back of the fire.
Okay. So again, accepting that something like 90% of the heat of any flame is going to be rising off the ground, not radiating towards a tree root or other material that might be immediately close to it, it's, as a matter of probabilities, very unlikely that the kind of fuel indicated for this area was going to be able to do much more than perhaps scorch the edge of the tree root.
The other part of the equation is it the running fire or the backing fire? So the backing fire, one of the characteristics of it is that it has very long residence time, and so it travels slowly back through, and so you'll actually get more consumption of finer fuels with the backing fire quite often in grassland than the running fire.
I'll ask the question again, Mr. Gilmore. As a matter of probability, it's very improbable that either a running or backing flame of the kind that we've been discussing would transfer enough heat into a root in the situation I've asked you to imagine so as to be able to ignite a prolonged smouldering burn in that root. It's a matter of probability, Mr.
Yes.
Gilmore.
It's so a scale of how probable, or a yes and no, or what are you seeking?
Well, let's just stick with plus or minus 50% at the moment, Mr. Gilmore. It is improbable that a flame in the situation I've asked you to imagine would be able to ignite a smouldering burn in the root that I've asked you to imagine.
Right. Yeah, I'll sit on the fence, sir. I'll take 50-50. I can't, with those parameters, give you an answer, I'm sorry.
All right. Now, in terms of your investigation of the photographs that were provided to you from 2013 and your examination of the site in 2018, you were not able to identify any affirmative evidence for any cause of ignition of the force of bushfire other than the hypothesis that had been identified by the TFS, were you?
No, we didn't identify a cause. No.
Right, okay. And based on all of the information that you have been able to observe through the whole course of your investigations, the only cause for the bushfire for which you've seen any affirmative evidence is the cause identified by the Tasmanian Fire Service, isn't it?
No, because I haven't seen the connection.
Okay. So putting to one side that issue of the connection, you can't identify anything that might explain the ignition of this fire.
Only possibilities.
Now, can we go to your third report, that is the February report. It's just the one-page one, Mr. Gilmore.
Oh, yes.
It's Court Book Document 16. Now, this is the one where you just deal with the issues about steam, reports of steam seen in the area of the tree stump.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are you aware of the evidence that Ms. Barrett has given to His Honour about where she thinks she saw the steam rising from?
I may be.
Okay.
I can't recall.
All right, could we go? Can I help you out? Can we go to document 24, please, Mr. Temponi? And in document 24, could we go to photograph 28? And zoom into the tree stump, sorry, the marker 7 tree stump. Now, the burden of Ms. Barrett's evidence in this trial, Mr. Gilmore, was that so far as she was able to identify it, the location from which she saw steam rising was about 2/3 of the way up the middle peak of the marker 7 tree stump, about where the cursor is. No, down a bit, please, Mr. Temponi. She seemed to indicate about there, Mr. Gilmore. Now, you would agree with me, I take it, that an observation of steam rising from that area following rain on a day after the campfire is at least an indication of continuing combustion occurring within the tree stump, isn't it?
Within or around, yes. Did she say where she was when she saw that?
She seemed to be over near the house. It was a question of whether she was in her car or standing on the ground, but looking at it generally from the direction of the house, it seemed.
Yep, so...
At the eastern end of the house, wasn't it? At the western end of the house.
Oh, okay, around near the dog yard end?
I'm just asking Mr. Armstrong.
No, I think it was at the eastern end of the house, Your Honour.
Yes, I'm sorry,
near
eastern end of the house.
Near the deck.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
But not on the deck, down at ground level, either in her car or standing on the ground.
Yes, that's
right.
My recollection, Your Honour. Now, next, Mr. Gilmore, could we go to the question of the path of the fire? Now, firstly, in your second report, and I think you've already given evidence to His Honour, your conclusion, based on the information available to you, was that the fire that came to be known as the Fawcett Bushfire started in the area of origin that you identified.
Yes, I'm quite comfortable with that, sir. Yes.
And is that still your opinion?
Yes.
And are you aware of any other evidence to suggest that there was a separate and unrelated wildfire that ignited in the area around 242 Whitehills Road, or between that location and Inala Road, in the early afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013?
Yeah, I think in my report I make some comment about Mr. Sutcliffe had walked into a fire.
Yes.
Which didn't seem to align with other things, and I think I made some comment to that effect.
You did. In your second report, you referred to Mr. Sutcliffe. Well, I think it would be fair to say you rather discounted his evidence. I think it's paragraph 99. If we could go back to Mr. Gilmore's second report, please, Mr. Temponi. And it's Court Book page 255. So does that assist your memory there, Mr.
Yes,
Gilmore?
the other thing I've seen since is some subsequent positioning of that location further. So he, and I assume this was in evidence, not in a statement or something that I read, but that he said that it was to the southwest of the Lawrence property, not to the west of it, in subsequent evidence, which puts it a bit further south than what I'd originally been looking at.
Yes. Now, firstly, Mr. Gilmore, given that you're aware of Mr. Sutcliffe's evidence that you referred to at paragraph 99 of your second report, and now aware of the further evidence that Mr. Sutcliffe has given at this trial, can I ask you firstly, does your review of that evidence cause you to change your opinion at all that the Fawcett bushfire started in the area of origin that you had identified?
There are two, if I can say, anomalies, and this is one of them. So there's that one, and then I think also in the report I mentioned another one, which is at the top of Warmby's Creek, where there's a run of fire, which both seem to be outside, laterally spread in the early stages, what I would have expected.
Okay, well, let's just take that in sequence then. Mr. Sutcliffe, in the report that you referred to here, and in the evidence that he gave to His Honour, referred to a fire that seemed, according to his timeline, to have started at around 1:30 p.m. So that's roughly 45 minutes before the first 000 call for the fire at Ms. Barrett's property.
Yep.
Now, can I ask you, is there anything that you've seen in the evidence that causes you to think that that account of a fire starting at 1:30 on that day is credible?
I haven't seen anything else
Right. Okay.
At that time.
Yep. And when we were discussing the fire spotters yesterday, as I understood the position we reached, you would have expected that if there had been a fire that ignited in this area at around 1:30 on the 3rd of January, it would have been picked up by the fire spotters within a number of minutes that's measured in single digits.
I would think so, although I don't think we quite got clear the clarity of the air.
Well, I think we got clear enough, Mr. Gilmore, that the air was clear enough at 2:15
And 3 o'clock.
Sorry, and 3 o'clock, Your Honour, that the fire spotters at Eaglehawk Neck were able to plot the location of the smoke.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that it is overwhelmingly likely that the air was equally clear at about 1:30 on that day.
I think that there was a large fire at Richmond. The wind was blowing the smoke in that direction, and in the early part, the bit I didn't get across properly is in the early stages it was stable. And when the atmosphere is stable, that's the Blue Hills type look during a day. So the visibility of the fire lookout observers is less when on a stable day. And the distance they can see varies. And sometimes the fire has to get big enough for them to see it. It's actually a very, very difficult job that they do.
It's not likely that any of those visibility factors changed in any material way between 1:30 and 2:30 on the 3rd of January, is it?
No, and not till much later in the afternoon.
Okay.
It got clearer.
Mr. Gilmore, please do try and attend to my questions because it's going to make this a lot quicker. You understand that I wasn't asking you about late in the afternoon of the 3rd of January.
No.
All of my questions were about the period from 1:30 to 2:30 or 3 o'clock.
Yes,
there was not likely to be
sir.
any change in visibility factors over that period, was there?
No.
And you would have expected that if there had been a fire that ignited in the area around Dunalley Road at about 1:30 on the 3rd of January 2013, it would have been called in at least by fire spotters within minutes.
The Eaglehawk Neck one in particular, sir, which gets a good look into that area.
I take it that's a yes, Mr. Gilmore.
Fire spotter, yes.
Thank you. And you would expect as well, wouldn't you, Mr. Gilmore, that residents in the area and people passing by the area, if they saw smoke rising from the area of Dunalley Road, at any time shortly after 1:30 on the 3rd of January, would also have been likely to call it in the way that residents in fact called in Ms. Barrett's fire at about 2:15.
Yes.
Thank you. So would you... now, you referred to that aspect of the anomaly in the overall pantheon of evidence that you've had regard to, Mr. Gilmore, and the other anomaly that you described was the fact that there was a burn pattern up near Warmby's Creek, which seemed to you to be slightly outside the area you would have expected, correct?
Yes, it did attract my attention, sir. Yes.
All right. So could Mr. Temponi please bring up Court Book 138? Now, does that photograph show you the area near Warmby's Creek that you're referring to, Mr.?
Almost. It disappears into the top margin there.
Okay, can we just perhaps then go to Court Book 150, which is at a slightly further back aspect. And so by reference to document 150, Mr. Gilmore, can you tell me what's the area that you're referring to?
Okay, so if we go to the left, Mr. Temponi, further to the left past line A, and a bit more stop. So that above there is an area of darkened vegetation where the crown of the trees has been removed, and so that heads up in a 45-degree angle from there. So you can see there's sort of like a big white patch which fills the centre quarter, I suppose, of this grid square, and then this darker area that I'm referring to.
So perhaps if
goes from where it was.
Could you direct Mr. Temponi?
So do you wish me to trace an outline
to draw
on it?
a line? Just
something?
general indication will suffice.
General
Mr.
indication,
Gilmore.
yep. Thank you, Mr. Temponi. So if you go down into the next grid square, and now across to the left, across, stop, up slightly, stop there, now down slightly. Now, if we head up to the right on a 45-degree angle, slowly, a bit more, stop, back about halfway, back, stop there. So that's the front of what I can see. And now if we progress to the top left of that square in that direction, yes, that's right along the edge, well done, yes, continue, and stop there and draw that line. And down to the left a little, yes, there. And then back, join it up. So that area there has some crown removal. To the top left of that area, there's a slight other bit of crown removal as well. But there's a gap in between those two little bits where there were no trees.
Okay. Now, that's... I'll start that abortive sentence again. Your observations of indicia as to the direction of fire travel in that area, I take it, were the observations made when you visited in November 2018?
But also the shape of the scar, so it is common for long, thin shapes when you get crowning to go with the wind.
Okay. Again, Mr. Gilmore, please just attend to the question. You reached your conclusions about the direction of fire travel at that location when you visited the site in 2018?
Yes.
And
no, the later visit. Sorry.
2020, was it?
2020, yes, and I was
right.
particularly keen to go and have a look there because it seemed like an anomaly to me, yes.
Okay. And in terms of the shape of the scar that you've sketched on the photograph that we see on the screen, how did you reach the conclusion as to the shape of the scar?
Here, through the crown removal of the trees that are there, showing on the satellite.
Perhaps I'll take this in stages. Did you start to think that this area was an anomaly prior to you first visiting the area yourself?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it, in fact...
Oh, yes. Prior to my visit to that location, yes.
Okay.
Yes, way prior.
Now,
yes.
can I ask you, please, what was it that caused you to think that that area was anomalous?
The intense crown fire in that area.
Okay, and how were you able to identify that there had been an intense crown fire in that area?
The removal of the foliage on the tops of the trees.
Sorry, my question was unclear. What material did you have available to you to record that there was material removed from the top of the trees in that area?
Oh yeah, what did I look at?
Yes.
A satellite image from the 30th of January, I think it is.
Right, okay. And then as a result of having observed the removal of crowns from the trees in that area, you then went and had a look at the area in 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And when you looked at that area, you were then able to identify direction of fire travel?
Yes.
And as a result of your examination of that area in 2020, you were able to form a view as to the boundaries of the area where there was both crown removal and indicia of fire travel from southeast to northwest.
No, fire travelled from northwest to southeast.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've misunderstood what you were saying.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
So fire, yeah, from the top left of that scar to the bottom right.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, perhaps Mr. Temponi could draw us a green arrow through that area to indicate direction so that I don't confuse myself again. Right, thank you. Okay. Now, given that you first identified that area as a potential anomaly from a photograph that was taken on about the 30th of January, I take it you can't offer any opinion to His Honour as to when it might have been that that area burned in the way that you've described.
No, and the other part of the anomaly is the shape of the scar and how far away from what appears to be the initial run of the fire that part of the fire is at the 5:35 or somewhere thereabouts mapping that was done from the air, so the pink line that shows here.
Right.
So it was wide quickly, and I think heard lots of evidence about fire travel and shapes and things. So this fire sort of ends up that shape, and that grabbed my attention as well.
Well, ends up in the slightly axe head type shape that you've drawn on the map. Is that what you're indicating with your arms?
No, I'm talking about the pink line now, that the fire got wide very quickly in that Warmbies Creek area, rather than being the shape that I would have expected.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I just need to be clear, Mr. Gilmore. When you say the pink line, you mean the
outline of the fire.
The outline of the fire.
Which my understanding is the 5:35 or thereabouts mapping.
5:35 line scan.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I think it was mapping.
Mapping, all right, sorry.
Yeah.
I accept the correction.
Yeah.
All right. Now, again, just to be clear, you were interested in this area because of what we might call the curve of the 5:35 mapping line as it passes through slightly to the northwest around the area that you've drawn, correct?
Yes, the width of the fire there.
I understand.
Yep.
And then when you looked at that area on a satellite photograph, you saw that there was crown removal of some of the trees.
Yes.
And the photograph that you looked at was dated about the 30th of January.
Yes, a satellite image, yes.
All right. And then you went out to the site in 2020 and you formed some conclusions about direction of fire travel that are now indicated with the green arrow.
Yes.
Right. Now, the information that you had available to you, the three factors that I've just mentioned, still gives you no information about when it was that the area that you've indicated burned in the direction that you've identified, does it?
Only before that mapping was done, yes.
Right. And do you assume that the map outline that we see here is to be regarded as also indicating that all of the crowns of trees that ultimately might have ended up burning would already have burned by the time the map outline was prepared?
I think that's a fair statement, yes.
Okay, so your assumption is that this crowning fire in that copse of trees had occurred by, or was occurring by the 5:35 on the 3rd of January.
Yeah, I would expect earlier than that, but, by the shape, but yes.
All right, now, okay, understood. Now, you've referred in your report a couple of times to the wind direction at the time of the fire as having been southwesterly.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
Have I understood you correctly?
Yes, there are a couple of references to that.
There are.
Mm.
And also in your 4th report, indeed, at paragraph 5.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the purpose of preparing your reports, did you look at the available meteorological data as to what the wind direction had been at the time?
Yeah, from the airport at
Yes.
the Hobart airport. Yes.
Right, and you understood from that data that the prevailing wind through the afternoon of the 3rd of January was west-northwest down to westerly.
And and then later on swung to the north, I think,
And
very late in the day. Yes.
Later on in the day, it swung around to the north, and you're aware as well that over the course of the next few days, the wind actually swung around to due north, and in fact, at some points, it was coming up from the south.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
I think it was due north about midnight from memory on that
Right.
first day.
And is it your understanding, Mr. Gilmore, that the area that's indicated by this 5:35 fire outline map in fact continued to burn for several days after the 3rd of January?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Now, given that the Hobart Airport wind station was recording wind as coming from the west or west-northwest, your assumption in your reports that the wind was southwesterly really requires a correction, doesn't it?
No, it's the shape here, for instance, that broad shape early, reflects wind being in different directions, I think, and I'm not sure if that's a wind factor or a convection factor. So when large areas are alight, the wind direction can actually be changed and convex in, and I assume you've had discussions about stability and air rotating, coming from above and going in, and so wind can be drawn into the convective area.
All right. Now, one of the notable things about this fire map, Mr. Gilmore, is the way that the fire boundary mapped here in its early stages to the southeast of marker A that we see on this map. The boundary of the force of bushfire skirts around the boundary of the area that had been the subject of the wildfire and backburning operations in October 2012. Do you agree?
Yes.
And I think you've referred in your reports to the fact that the scarred area from what I'll call the October fire, in fact we might call it the October scar,
Yep.
the October scar acted as a quite effective fire break to the travel of the Fawcett fire.
Yes, it would have pulled it up in those early stages, the head fire progression.
Yep. And you've referred in your report to the fact that the wind conditions and the terrain and the fuel types, in particular the stringy bark and gum bark trees that were in that area, were likely to have been causing a lot of production of firebrands and spotting generally to the east of the fire front by the time it had reached at least about 100 to 200 metres wide at the fire front.
Yes.
You agree with all of that?
Yes, agree with that, yes.
And those firebrands being thrown from a fire in the area indicated by the red hatched lines near marker 1 on this map, you would agree with me were by 240 or 245 very likely to be able easily to travel across to roughly the area of, sorry, at least the area of line A on this map.
That wasn't my impression. My impression was as it got further and steeper and ran uphill, it would have produced more firebrands in that area there. So perhaps a bit to the right of the hatched area, steepness running up towards the hill at 244.
Right.
It is what I had in my mind from what I'd seen.
Okay, so Mr. Temponi seems to actually have the cursor at the moment in an area that's slightly to the left of the hatched line. Is that the location that where you think that the fire would have become sufficiently established to create the spotting that you've just described?
To reach the distance, I would go to the right, Mr. Temponi. To the right, to the right, to the right, down a little. And, sorry, too much down, up just a bit. Yep. So if you go across to the right there until you reach the edge of that burnt area, so if you just head, straight across, thank you. To that edge, yes, thank you. And then when you enlarge the satellite photos, that some of these lines disappeared, it becomes a bit more visible. But if you go straight up to the house to the top left at 244, now come back along that line about, to there, yep. And then join those up in a triangular shape. That's the bit that had my attention as to possibly where this longer distance spotting would have got it over the burnt area.
Okay. Could we perhaps draw that area in green, Mr. Temponi? So starting at the house at 244, and then going where, Mr. Gilmore?
Down along the fire scar. Yep. Down to a little bit further, sir. Thank you. And then across to the west. A bit further, bit further, bit further. And then join that up in a triangle shape, So I think you can see the larger trees in that area with blackened tops. And my impression of what's happening in the fire behaviour there is it's almost crowning, and on the gust you would see flames appearing through the trees, and then on the average speed not, and then again and again. So but when that's enlarged, it shows various patches through there.
Right. And so, in summary, by the time the fire had reached into any of the green triangle that you've just indicated, you would have considered it very plausible that it would be sending up firebrands that were able to travel at least across to line A and be capable of starting spot fires in the area of line A. Is that a summary?
Between the scar, the old burn scar, and line A is the area I would expect to see spot fires in.
Right, okay. Now, going back to the issue of the shape of the overall 535 fire boundary, Mr. Gilmore, if we assume away from this map the area of the October fire scar and its retarding effect on the spread of the Fawcett bushfire, you would expect that there would be something more of a straightish line between marker 1 and the edge of the boundary, the Fawcett fire boundary, where Mr. Temponi's now got the cursor, wouldn't you?
I would expect it to be a bit further to the south with the northwesterly wind. So if we went right over to the right, Mr. Temponi, a square over to the right, so if you shoot over there, about another half a square to the right, sorry, yes, just there, beautiful. If you went from the edge of the mapped fire there, above you, back to marker 1, that's under those conditions what I would expect the shape to look like.
Mr. Temponi, could you draw that line in green as well, please? Just as a roughly straight line will do for the moment. All right, so is that a fair enough representation of roughly what you would have expected?
Yeah, it's a rough expectation, yes.
Okay.
Agree with that.
Now, you would agree, wouldn't you, Mr. Gilmore, that in gusty wind conditions with stringy bark or gum bark or other types of firebrands flying around through hilly terrain like this, you're going to get a fairly random scatter, generally in the eastward direction, of spot fires, aren't you?
Yeah. It's dependent on the wind speed. The stronger the wind, the skinnier and straighter the fire.
Yes.
And then the movement of the wind is the other thing. So fire never gets narrower.
Yes.
It always gets wider. So
and
it would depend on those two.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You've indicated in your report that hills of the kind that you know to be in this area do have a disturbing effect on wind patterns, don't they?
Yes.
And so even a due westerly wind is likely to vary a few compass points, possibly even more than a few compass points, as it bends around hills and follows towards the east.
Yes, and the large, well, there's two things probably to consider. One is the wind funneling through gaps, and things will quite often get called gaps, and the road quite often goes through the gap as well. So the wind will follow the gap, and there's a gap south of 244
that
I would expect it to have followed. And then as wind goes over the hills, I would expect an eddy to come up from underneath, and that seems very obvious to me at the Red Hill, Mother Brown's Bonnet end, where the fire has virtually stopped while the wind's still blowing. Mm-hmm. So, but it's quite a few hundred metres above the rest of the landscape.
And given that potential for the wind pattern to be disturbed by features like hills and saddles and gaps and gullies and ridges and what have you, it wouldn't be surprising at all, would it, that a firebrand emitted from, say, the area of your green triangle might be carried by a generally westerly wind across the October scar and into the area at the base of your green arrow, would it?
It doesn't strike me as what I expected to be there. So I suppose the answer is no.
Okay. You're not suggesting that it's implausible, though, are you?
It's possible. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In fact, it's more than possible. It's actually quite likely.
No, that's why it grabbed my attention.
All right. Then in terms of the impact that the October scar had in terms of slowing or shaping the spread of the Fawcett fire, a fire running generally, I'll start again. If the wind, as it's hitting the Fawcett fire in the area of the red hatching near marker 1, was travelling from the west or west-northwest, then you would expect the fire to move in an east to east-southeast direction, correct?
Apart from the effect, the two effects. One, the channeling through that little valley there.
Yes.
Of the wind, as we just discussed. The other one is the effective slope. So, and there's been some work, I think I referred to it in one of the reports, some work where we're trying to quantify that effective slope, because young practitioners in burning, if they lose a burn, it's quite often because they haven't factored in the slope. They've followed the wind, and the fire moves up the slope more than with the wind.
Okay, and so that first little area between, say, marker 1 and the cluster of markers around 11, 9, 6 and 8.
Yes.
That generally traces what might be called a saddle or a bit of a gully, doesn't it?
Yes, yep.
And so do I understand your evidence to be that topography is a powerful predictor of ending up with a fire boundary like we see actually mapped here? That is, the gully
Not sure.
explains. Sorry, the gully is a large explanatory factor for the first part of the spread of this fire.
Could be, yes. I'd expect it to go down the gully, yes.
Okay. And a fire that's being channeled by the wind and shaped by the topography to run towards the southeast, down towards marker 11, is going to brush against the October scar area on its flank more than at its front, isn't it?
Well, my impression would be that the front would have disappeared by now, and that would be a flank. So if we drew a flank along sort of like the bottom of Dr. Marsden Smedley's line and the bottom of my triangle, and then thought about fire flanking down to the south, is how I would expect that. So I wouldn't expect a full head fire intensity, and that's matched by the damage that's evident. So there's no indication of head fire until we get way down sort of below the star next to 11. There's more head fire down there.
Right.
But in that area, I'm expecting it's hitting up against the burn, and the right-hand flank or the southern flank is moving and moving and moving.
Right. Well, just to be clear here, Mr. Gilmore, and work with me for a moment, the fire as it moves between marker 1 and marker 11, the downwind edge of that fire is what would be called the fire front, isn't it?
Well, it's not what I would call the front. So I call the front, the fire is long and thin. This is the bit that's the front. That's what I call the front. Sometimes people do refer to the side of the fire as the front.
No, I'm not one of those people, Mr. Gilmore. I've done a few of these.
Yep.
Now, the downwind edge of a running fire is the front of the fire, or the head of the fire, isn't it?
Yes.
It's always the head of the fire. It's always the front of the fire.
Unless it's affected by the slope, so yes. So the slope will overtake the
Pause,
wind.
Mr. Gilmore. There are at least 3 sides to a wildfire: the front, the flanks, and the backing edge, correct?
Yeah, that's fair enough, yes.
Are there any others?
Oh, there's little descriptions like fingers and those sorts of things, but yes.
Probably put fingers to one side here, can't we?
Yes.
The downwind edge of a wildfire is always the head.
Unless there's slope.
Okay.
And slope, as I said, is where it overtakes.
And in the topography that we're looking at between markers 1 and 11, the fire, as it runs from 1 down towards 11, the edge of the fire nearest 11 at any given point in time is what would be called the front or the head, isn't it?
Well, once it gets in the area of 11, yes.
Okay.
Because the effective slope is removed, yes.
All right. Let's say the southeast edge of the red hatched area. The fire at that point is still moving primarily under the influence of wind, isn't it? It's being blown
Yes.
to the southeast.
Yes.
So the fire at the southeast edge of the red hatched area would be called the front of that fire, wouldn't it? The front is moving towards marker 11.
Yes, it could be. Yes.
Thank you. Now, on either side of that moving front would be, firstly, a flank burning slightly towards the northeast.
I think that flank virtually ran up the driveway of 244. That's my impression of what occurred.
Yes.
Yes.
And then once it hits the October scar area, it's retarded, and that flank is slowed down and doesn't burn very far into the October scar, does it?
No, it would be a head that ran into the scar area, south of the house there.
So are you saying it would be one of the heads?
No, it would be, the initial run would be head fire. The slope would significantly affect the movement of the fire, and our estimates are about 10 degrees to 20 k's.
Right.
So for every 10 degrees, it's another 20 k's. So 30 degrees is 60 k's of wind, the slope will overtake it. And so there would be significantly more fire movement to the northeast, if you like, up that slope towards the scar. And that would have some effect on the fire on the other side, by this convection being drawn in. Wherever it's hottest is the most chimney, and so that will draw fire in that direction.
I see the time, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you. We'll adjourn for the morning break for a quarter of an hour. Can I just let you know, Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Reid, that I'll have to adjourn a little bit before 12:30 today.
So, thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Will stand, please. This honourable court now stands adjourned.